So the session we're going to actually take a look at today is migrating AX 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations, the approach and the strategy that what we have with regards to us providing the necessary tooling for us to be able to help customers, partners who are currently working with 2009 to facilitate them to be able to actually move to Dynamics 365 for operations. So the key set of takeaways from this session, right? We'll do a pretty good deep dive of the demos of the tool itself, so that should give you an idea in terms of what we are providing as out-of-the-box support from a tooling perspective for you to be able to actually migrate your data from 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations. And we'll talk a little bit about what's coming in the roadmap as well in terms of where we are, as well as what we are continuing to work on as part of this tool, so that the tool is comprehensive enough to cover the complete breadth of the product in terms of what it used to be from a 2009 perspective, so that you can take advantage of being able to migrate your data using this. I'll talk a little bit about what we are doing with regards to where we are with the tooling as well from a timeline perspective, as well as talk about how you can get access to this tool from the aspect of you to be able to actually get your hands on the tool itself and then try the tool as well as use the tool. So that's sort of the objectives for this session. So that goes hand in hand with the agenda in terms of what we intend to talk about. We'll talk about what our approach is with regards to us helping you with if you are working on 2009. We'll go into the architecture of what the tool supports in terms of or how the tool is expected to work. We'll go through the migration approach itself as how we are recommending that you do the migration. We'll go through a pretty detailed demo. That's probably where we'll spend majority of the time. Don't have a lot of slides, so it's going to be really showing you the product and then walking you through with the scenarios of how you would be going through the migration and then showing that to you directly from the product itself. So less slides, more demos. Right, and then towards the end, we'll talk about the timeline and the roadmap stuff. Good? Just a little bit of introduction. My name is Manoj Swaminathan. I manage the solution architecture group as part of the R&D, especially focused on Dynamics 365 for operations. So you guys all must be familiar with the solution architecture team, so I won't go into it in a bit more detail. There was supposed to be Mudit, who was supposed to be with me here, so he couldn't make it today. So apologies for that. Mudit, you all may have known as well. Mudit used to lead our data management aspects of things, so he is the engineering lead on this initiative as well. So he was the one who actually worked on this tool from a development standpoint. So what our target scenario is, right? So the focus for us is AX 2009. We've done this release in about 2008, and then it's been in the market since then. And the product from an AX perspective have evolved significantly since the time we've actually started, since the release of 2009. We've evolved the product both in terms of the functional capabilities as well as the technical capabilities of the product. Well, we still have significant customer base in 2009 and who have not gone into AX 2012 or Dynamics 365 for operations for that matter. So we want to make sure that we provide a mechanism for customers who are still in 2009 to be able to migrate to Dynamics 365. There's two aspects every time we think about migration. One is code, the other one is the data. From a code perspective, it's no different than how you would go through the typical code upgrade exercise, right? So you would go through the same set of things with the 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations as well. If you recall, we had provided an aspect of supporting upgrades from AX 2009 to AX 2012 release. So we're taking a different approach for customers coming from AX 2009. For them to be able to get to Dynamics 365 for operations. The code upgrade, there's no change from the way as how you would typically approach your code migration. The only thing that which you would do is you would go through the exercise of actually understanding what has changed in the product from AX 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations as part of your upgrade analysis. And then you would determine which of your customizations that you want to carry forward, and you would do the necessary code migration only for those. Right? So there's no difference to that approach. We don't have any special requirements around that, other than the fact that take a look at Dynamics 365 for operations, because there's significant functional changes as well as the technical changes towards that you should be able to take advantage of from what you've been doing from AX 2009. So it should help you with regards to that. So other than that aspect of it, there's no change. But from a data perspective, we wanted to actually give you a path to migrate your data so that all the investments that what you have actually done with regards to your 2009 from a configuration perspective, the data in terms of all the transactions that what you have been going through, as well as the sort of accounting and the information that what you have had, we want to give you a path to be able to migrate. So that's primarily the target from a tooling perspective that we have been investing, and that's what you will actually see in action today. So we wanted to provide an ability to be able to migrate legacy AX versions, and we wanted this to be something that we wanted to support for all flavors of the legacy versions. So that means AX 4.0, AX 3.0, etc. as well. But we're starting with AX 2009 as a primary focus. So what does the data migration include? Our primary focus is, I'm categorically using the word migrate as opposed to an upgrade. So the traditional upgrade is move all your data, right? So we're not doing that, and we don't want to do that. What we want to do is, as part of the data migration, right? So we will give you out-of-the-box support for everything about configurations and the setup within the product. All aspects of the master data, like your customers, vendors, projects, accounts, etc., will help you to actually transfer the opening balances. We'll give you an ability to be able to move your open documents. So that's basically your open purchase orders, open sales orders, etc. And all the system configurations like the users, number sequences, aspects of things that what you would typically... So it's primarily setup and configurations, master data, opening balances, and then the open transactions. The focus is to give you the business continuity so that you could actually close your stuff from 2009 and formally transition to Dynamics 365 for operations. Fundamentally, the system actually uses data entities as a means in terms of actually migrating. It uses the data export-import framework, and you will see that in a bit from an architecture perspective as well as from the demo, right? So, can I only move this data? The answer is no, you can actually move pretty much anything. So that includes not necessarily the out-of-the-box shipped ones, but also the customizations that you may have done in any of these areas. You would be able to actually migrate data pertaining to those as well. So that means if you've added tables, you've added fields to an existing table, all of those can be folded into this tool, and then the tool will recognize those changes and you can actually migrate those too. Technically, anything that you can have an entity representation in Dynamics 365 for operations, and if you had the data in AX 2009, you would be able to migrate them using this tool. Right? So the question was, I don't see legal entities in this sort of thing. So we'll actually do that as part of our initial migration itself. It depends on how the approach itself, and I'll talk about that when we actually go through the methodology in terms of how we would actually do that.
Can I ask, when you say open transactions, you do mean transactions that have not even begun to do any shipping, right? You have to have them at the create state. I know that's always been a problem in the past, that if you did a shipment, but you didn't do an invoice, then you really have problems if you try to migrate that data. Is it still the same way?
So the question is, what does really open means? Is it like any state of the open, or only at the stage where the document is created in terms of... So this can even be in a state where you can actually have open invoices. does not necessarily have to be. So as long as it is a document that's not accounted and posted in general ledger, so those are what we refer to as an open transaction, and you should be able to actually migrate them. Hold the questions. We'll get to it towards the end. So we'll definitely have a good Q&A round, so hold the questions, please. So very quick, right? So like I said, we won't spend too much time on the slides. We'll actually jump to the demo. And you will have plenty of opportunities to have questions. And hopefully I'll answer some of the questions as I walk through the demo as well. So we'll see. So from a migration process perspective, right? So I'll complete the build. Right? So from a migration process perspective, this is sort of the approach that what we expect that you would typically be going through, and the tool has to be able to actually facilitate that. This applies to any migration process, not necessarily this, but this is sort of what we expect you to be doing. So you would go through the analysis phase, make sure in terms of what you would really want to migrate. You can actually go do a level of pre-processing. This is basically all the data cleanup that you want to do, remove all the unwanted data stuff that you don't need. And once you have actually completed that, you can actually use the tool to configure and to say what information you want to extract. And once you have extracted that, the tool actually gives you the extracted information as data packages. So you're all familiar with the data management framework with Dynamics 365 for operations, right? So when I say data package, you know what that means. Yes? No? Good. So data package is almost like a zip file if you were to. It actually carries information about all the different entities that you would want to export along with the manifest, right? So that you can actually give as an input into Dynamics 365 for operations data management. And that basically will be able to import that into the staging, and then you can do another level of transformations in your staging and then cleanse the data right in the staging before you move them into your target. And then once you have the data in your target, you can basically start validating your system. So the first 3 steps are the ones that what you do from AX 2009 standpoint. The next 4 steps, you do them in Dynamics 365 for operations, right? Once you have the data exported, you don't necessarily have to go back to 2009 to repeat these things. Until you get the data perfected, you could basically operate within the staging all the way to the target within the data management framework. You don't need to leave that space at all, right? So one of the things that what you would probably need is you're not going to be left with just doing this one time. You would continue to be doing your business using AX 2009 system. So the tool has to be able to support incremental iterations too. So absolutely, as the tool will support incremental iterations. So it goes by the modified datetime aspects in terms of actually tracking the changes, and it will extract the deltas for the same configurations that you had originally exported, and that flow again flows through the same data management framework aspects as well. So initial migration and the incremental ones from a methodology standpoint follows the same, using both the tool at the source as well as the ability for you to be able to load the data on the target. Very quick look at the architecture. So you have your 2009 system, and you have your Dynamics 365 for operations, a reference sandbox, and we'll give you the tool, and the tool gets installed in AX 2009. The only requirement for the Dynamics 365 for operations sandbox, in order for you to be able to use that tool, is you've done the analysis and you've done the necessary code migrations for the customizations that you intend to retain. Basically, the data model changes should have been brought in, and you have created entity extensions for those data model changes that you've brought in. Those are the only prerequisites for you to be able to actually have the tool realize your customizations as well. Then you install the tool. You go through the bit of pre-processing to clean up the data before you start the export. Do the configurations using the tool to say what all information that you want to export. The tool uses data export import framework service. So one of the things that comes as part of the tool is we have backported the AX 2012 data export import framework service to 2009 as well now. So that runs as the same way as how it runs in 2012. So it runs as a service, and the service actually understands the export configurations that you've defined, reads the data from 2009, generates the export files for every table that you said that you would want to export, uses the tool's mapping definitions, creates the package. We have now if you had seen my original presentations, I would have said the package gets created and it gets into a file system. We've enhanced the tool's capability now to be able to actually directly import from AX 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations. You can actually specify that you would want to do that as an option, and we'll do that for you as well. So that's in a nutshell in terms of the high-level architecture, right? So without much ado, let's go to the demo of the product, right? So for some of you, if you've seen my earlier session, specifically the folks who've attended the user group conferences, I would have shown you this as a checklist. So since then, we've actually modified this. We now have a proper menu area for data migration. So under all the other set of modules that what you have data migration as one of the area that what we have. So it's like a module now where you manage everything about the data migrations right here. So once you have actually installed the tool, the first thing that what you would do, you would actually go through the company list. So this is where you actually specify which of those companies that you would want to migrate. So you would basically see the list of companies that are there in the system. And you can come in and enable the companies that you would want. So the first thing that to identify is you don't have to migrate all companies. You can actually migrate company by company, and that's perfectly fine. So you can maintain your export configurations, and you can enable each company one at a time, and then you can migrate the data using the same configuration for the respective companies as you are ready for that company. So that's supported. So once you enable a company for migration, right, you can actually get to calculate this with the details, and when you select this, for the first time it will actually go in and compute. This is the first sort of information that what you would need. So for that company that you've enabled for migration, this will actually show you all tables, not only the standard tables, but also your customizations. And it will show you the number of records that are there in the table pertaining to this company. So the first piece of information that you would need in a migration, because you need to be able to know how many records that you're starting with, so that once it gets moved to the target, you have a basis to validate that you did indeed get the same set of records on the target side. This actually keeps track of your customizations as well. So you can actually export this information and then look at which of the standard tables that you have actually customized are the ones that are custom tables. Understand the data patterns in terms of where your data is. And based on the categorization, you can determine to see if for every one of those that you intend to migrate, whether it's setup or whether it's configurations, you can actually look at, did you move the data, did you create the data entities in the Dynamics 365 for operations? And is everything pertaining to your customizations is all there? And you know exactly which ones you intend to migrate, and you can do that cross-checking right there. So this has a bunch of information that's useful for you to be able to actually start planning for your migration, just from a technical standpoint, right? And of course, there'll be a functional set of folks within the team who would go through the exercise of understanding, in a way, as how you've been using the application, what maps to what from the source to target, so that you can actually go through that migration exercise. So this is super useful from that perspective, and you can come back and refresh this as many times as you want. AX 2009 also had another construct, which is virtual companies, right? So that was the only basis by which we supported data sharing, if you were to. So this was heavily used. There's no equivalent of virtual companies in Dynamics 365 for operations. So the model that we recommend is, as part of you defining the virtual company, you would have defined a legal entity as a virtual one, and then you would have defined the mappings for the actual legal entities that would be using the data in the virtual company as a shared data. So for the same relationship, when you do the migration, you would have actually, the expectation is that you define the actual legal entities on the target. So this goes back to one of the questions that one of you asked about legal entities. So we expect that you actually have the starting legal entities in terms of whatever that you've been using. So if you had like 10 legal entities, 2 of them were virtual, you would at least have your 8 legal entities created on the target to begin with. You wouldn't bring these 2 virtual legal entities there. From an export perspective, it doesn't carry any reference other than the fact that it exports information from that legal entity. But the data that's exported doesn't carry any reference to that. So that same exported data can be imported into all the target legal entities. So the model is data replication and not data sharing on the target side yet. So we do have an initiative to support data sharing in our roadmap. But from a configurations perspective, we support you maintaining the data in one legal entity and define rules to replicate that data into other legal entities. You would have seen that pattern in Dynamics 365 for operations. That is the way as how we intend to maintain all these configuration information. Okay. So once you have actually defined this, there's like any other modules, you have parameters. We have set up parameters in the migration aspects as well. So we'll take a quick look at this one. Right. So there's 2 sets of things. One is information about AX 2009. And then information about where's your Dynamics 365 for operations sandbox. So you provide these 2 pieces of information. So let's take a look at what we are doing with regards to AX 2009, right? So the first thing is where you have installed the DIXF service. So since I'm doing this demo from a one box, so it's just a local host, but if it is not, you would actually specify the actual server where you have installed the DIXF tool on the 2009 system. You have an ability to specify the export formats. The system uses export-import format, the integration services, so it uses the SQL connection. So you provide the SQL information in terms of how to access that. The next piece of information is, if you recall, I mentioned about once it exports the information after doing the mapping and stuff, it exports that information as packages. So where do you want to store the package? So that's another information that you specify. The only requirement for this is wherever you provide this as a file system, it needs to be something that the AOS can write. That's it. So other than that, there is no other requirement. It can be any file share. Then the 2 pieces of information that is interesting, right? So from an AX 2009 perspective, we have the data export import service. We don't expect you to have data entities on the source side. We're not expecting you to actually have data entities on the source. So on the source, you only have tables, that what you have, which is the standard tables, as well as the customized ones. On the target side, which is Dynamics 365 for operations, you have data entities, and we map your 2009 tables to the staging representation of those data entities on the target. So that's how this is done. We provide an out-of-the-box mapping for everything that is standard. And that is basically is what that configure defaults is. So if you look into this one, you will be able to actually see by module what is the source table and a corresponding target entity. So this is something that we have seeded out of the box. You can also provide, if you don't provide anything, it issues a query pertaining to select star from, for example, in this one, if this is an interest that you want to migrate, it'll do a query like select star from tax 1099 fields for you to be able to as an export query. And then it'll map that to the fields appropriate in the tax 1099 fields entity on the target side. So that's how it's doing this work for you, right? You can actually go in and look at the field mapping, and you can modify those field mappings if you would want to. You can also modify the source query. And this is not an X++ syntax, it's basically ANSI SQL. So you can actually use any standard SQL functions, and then you can actually provide your SQL query here. So if you want to do case type expressions, those are supported as part of this one. So that's the first step so we seed this for out of the box for everything that we ship. And you can actually go in and extend. From an extension perspective, unless you need to modify the mapping, unless you want to modify the source query, for all your customizations, you don't need to do anything. As long as your data entities are there on the target, which is whatever the one that which you're going to be pointing to the tool as where your Dynamics 365 sandbox is. We will read that metadata and we will do this. And the way as how you would do that is by selecting the generate maps. So this is a process. When you select the button, it basically goes and reads the information based on where you've specified where is your Dynamics 365 for operations instance. And it pulls the metadata and it maintains the mapping for your customizations too. So that's basically, so all you provide here is a sandbox of where you have your Dynamics 365 for operations. Then a couple of more things which are minor. So what you would like to use is your chart of accounts delimiter. And we'll talk about this increment when we go through the migration groups and stuff. So fairly light in terms of the parameters. So some sort of information about how you would like to use the system from a 2009 perspective. And then where's your Dynamics 365 for operations so that we could read the metadata. And then towards the end when you want to load, you could optionally load it into this instance directly. If it's not this instance, then you can export it to a file system and then import the data package using lifecycle services or directly on the target environment's data management framework. Right? So that's what we're doing. I didn't talk about one option called apply conversions. We'll talk about that next. So in any migration, right, so it is quite possible that the source to target, the data might be represented differently and you need some bit of conversions or the data conversions that you need to go do. So we provide some ability for you to be able to convert data at the source itself. So that's what this data conversion is all about. So scenarios could be like you never used to capture information on the source, but you need to capture that information on the target. So something that's blank need to have a value on the target. So you have an ability to be able to define. So here's an example like, the blank country region code from a customer standpoint, from a cust table. So the source value could be blank and the target value could be used. If there's multiple values that you need to actually go in and do, and you need to use them in different places, you can actually do one or more of these, and that's perfectly fine. And there is a place where you associate this conversion rule to be applied to a field. But the way as how you define this for an EDT or an enum, for an extended data type or an enumeration. So wherever the field that uses this EDT, this conversion rule will be automatically applied if this is the only conversion rule that's defined. If you have more than one, you get to pick the conversion rule that you want to use, and I'll show you that as well. So another example from an enum perspective, right? So if you look at the unit conversion, so these are the source enumeration values, like the round off, up and decrease. And then from a target perspective, they are mapped to the nearest up and down, right? So this metadata is again inferred as part of our read from the target. And you can actually go in and map these things. So the form basically does the value validation. In the case of enumeration, it makes sure that it's only the allowed values. And in the other case, which is in the free form set of extended data types, it does the data type validations for you to make sure that it doesn't. So that's sort of the things that what the conversion rules support. So in the parameters, you have an ability to say apply the conversion as a global rule. And then once you define these rules at the EDT level or at the enumeration, any place where it's being used, any field that uses that, the system automatically picks that conversion for you. The next four things, right, are basically constructs that's changed from AX 2009, and these concepts changed in 2012. But again, they got carried forward into Dynamics 365 for operations. So we give you a path to migrate. So those are this. So financial dimensions, as you all know, is a concept that changed from AX 2009 to 2012. So we moved from an array-based fields to backing entity-based, backing table-based dimensions, and we supported unlimited dimensions as part of AX 2012. So same concepts is now there in Dynamics 365 for operations. So we have an entity that supports this migration for you. So all you need to specify as part of your configuration is for your existing dimensions that you've been using in 2009, you map that to one of the target dimensions that what we have in the system. So we have defined these as out-of-the-box dimensions. If you can map to one of these dimensions, we load the data into those backing tables. If it's not mapped to any of these standard dimensions, you can select the custom dimension and we will do the creation of the backing table and then populating the data using that entity for you. All you need to do is just map this and then select enable. And if you want to maintain the dimension level balances, enable the opening balance and we'll calculate them and then we'll actually migrate them. Obviously, this is only there for the ones that which you had as dimensions. Net new ones obviously won't have any impact on this one if you select the opening balance. Same holds good on the inventory dimension. So by legal entity, you can actually specify which of these are enabled. This is used in two ways. So I talked about we support migrating the open transactions. So inventory dimensions will not be available as just the disjointed fields. There is a combination that's stored as well in AX2012. So as part of this migration, based off of whichever ones that you enable, we actually have the combinations for any open transactions. In the same way as how you use them in the export-import situations, we will actually have those enabled fields supported in your staging. So you can actually bring them as fields and we'll map that to the combination as part of the target loop. Right? So all you do is you just come in and specify which ones you would want to enable. So chart of accounts and ledger are another set of constructs that changed again in 2012 from 2009, which got carried forward. So sorry. So in a demo of this sort where you're relying on connections and a remote desktop machine, you pray to demo God so much. Maybe I didn't pray enough, right? So it's fine. All right. So very quickly, configure chart of accounts and the configure ledger, right? So we've changed the chart of accounts for us to be able to support shared chart of accounts. So prior to that, 2009 only supported company-specific chart of accounts. So you have an ability to be able to modify your chart of accounts setup as part of this migration if you would like to enable sharing, right? If not, all you do is maybe I need help from all of you. Oh God. I'm really sorry.
Check to remember me and maybe it will reconnect faster after you sign in.
I'm really sorry. That's the problem. Somebody else is using it at the same time. It's fine. Okay. So this should be fine. So hopefully we'll go through this now. No, I don't want you guys debugging this. All right. All right. So sincere apologies again. So let's go through this one more time. So configure chart of accounts. So if you intend to share, you have an ability to be able to come in and share. If it is not, you just want to do company specific, which is an example that I'm actually showing you here. So all you need to do is you just come in and create a record here. And in the details, you specify that this chart of accounts is associated with this legal entity. So you could come in and do this once and then map all legal entities that you have enabled. That's the way as how you would share. And when you do that, we would actually compute the opening balances for you for those and then map them appropriately as part of that. And that's what that entity does. The last but not the least, ledger is a construct that got added. So along with the legal entity, the ledger was introduced to capture the accounting definition in terms of how any transactions created in that legal entity should be accounted. So that's what you do with this thing. So if you have gone through the 2009 to 2012 upgrade, we actually do this behind the scenes and we just create one ledger record for a legal entity. Because we're giving you an option to map different chart of accounts and stuff, so we're giving you an option to determine how you want to do the ledger definition as well. A ledger is nothing but a combination of calendar, chart of accounts, and a currency. So that's what you do here. So you specify your chart of accounts that you want to use for that legal entity, and then you specify what is the calendar and the currency that you want to use. So we use this information and then create the ledger for the legal entity. So from a target perspective, all we want is just the legal entities to be there. And then using this definition, you can actually migrate all your accounts and all of those. So those are basically the primitives that which you would need for you to be able to. And then your configurations, right? So that's where the entity list really comes into play. So this one, we will spend a good portion of time on this one. So if you see on the left, we see the modules. So that's basically where, we have categorized by module, everything that is pertaining to setup, configurations, transactions, master data, journals, and the miscellaneous aspects of things. These are basically as how you've classified your tables. Right? So as long as you've classified them right, they would show them under the right buckets. So that's basically what you see. And depending on whatever level that you select, the system basically will show you the corresponding information on the right-hand side for you. So in this case, I've just selected the customer group, for example, right? So you see that the system has actually selected only that information. But if you go to a level above, it'll basically show you all of those tables. But this is what I was referring to. On the source side, you have them as tables. And on the target side, you have them as data entities. So right now, I haven't done anything. This is the first time as if you would come to the screen. If you scroll to the right, you see the basic set of row counts, that what you would see. And you see this, that the system has actually enabled this for considered for migration. This is basically as how we have done this. In terms of, remember I was telling you that we would provide out-of-the-box support for all of these configurations and stuff. So we have actually considered these things as something that which is enabled by default for migration. You can actually enable the ones that which we haven't done. You can actually do that too. There's plenty of options in here, and we'll actually go through that one by one as part of this thing, right? So the first thing that you would do is you can actually activate this, which is basically selecting this particular entity for migration. There are a set of things that what we support. So for the first time when you come in, none of this would be enabled. You can do this thing called discover. When you do this discover, it basically goes and does the analysis for every single set of tables in your source system, and it counts the rows that are there in this per table, and it maps that to the entity, and it will give you a good coverage picture in terms of what it is there for this entity. And this is super important. So I'll show this to you from the perspective of everything, right? So when you go to this entity coverage, you can actually see, and this is super important from a migration planning perspective. So often I get asked this question, hey, how much will be covered by this migration? Right? How much should I plan for and how much will be covered by the migration? Should I need to go in and do more, or will the tool take care of everything for me? So the tool doesn't take care of everything for you by default, right? So remember, it's going to help you with everything with regards to those standard set of things that what we talked about. It gives you an ability to be able to move customizations as long as you have entity representation for those. But this gives you a pretty good coverage view in terms of what your system status is and what the entity coverage is and how much can be migrated by module area. So this is another useful information that helps you with the migration plan. Right? And you can look at it from the perspective of legal entity. You can look at it from the perspective of individual modules by company as well. And that gives you a good coverage estimate in terms of, any place where you see a good 80-90% coverage, that's super useful. Any places where you see low usage, that means you need to actually go in and do some work in that particular area. And the work would be in one of those categories, right? So one is either the configurations is what you've marked, there's no entity representation for those, and you need to actually create entities on the target and do the generate mappings. And when you do that, you can actually bring the coverage up. And any case, as you are finding those things and you find that it is a standard table for which we haven't provided the entities, please log a bug. We'll actually create that entity for you and then we'll provide it to you in a meaningful time frame that aligns with your schedule. So we give you that commitment in terms of completing the gaps for where we have in those entities. So I don't want you to actually go in and customize and create new entities by yourself for the one that should ideally be a standard entity. So if there is a case like that, please let us know and we'll go and do that. But bar that, if you have customizations, you need to make sure that you have there, and that will bring in the right coverage for you. So coming back to the entity details, right? So if this is the one that I want to do, if this is customer group is the one that I'm interested in, just for an example, right? I have an ability to say activate all, which is basically enable everything for migration, or I can say only do activate related for the migration. So the first thing that I'm going to do is select this for migration. And when I do select this, this will give me an option to say save. So remember, I talked about as part of you defining your export configuration, for every export configuration, when you do the export, it actually generates them as a package. So this is how you are actually defining your export configuration. You can actually do the export configurations for everything in the system by selecting all. You could do this by module. You could do this within an area with certain types of tables within a module. So you don't have to think of this as all or nothing. So you can do company by company. You can do module area by module area too. So if you wanted to do phased implementation, you can do those types of migration too. So in this case, I'm only interested in this particular one. So when it says save, right? So in this case, I'm just going to give this a name. You can basically see that it creates this under the current version, and then it also created a package name. So this is the name in which it will actually create the package when it does the export for you, right? So one thing that I can do is I can find out if this cust group table is actually referencing any other tables. I also want those to be imported along with this thing. So in order to enable that, we have given you a feature called activate related. So along with enabling this, you can also do this activate related. When you do this, it will basically go and discover dependencies tied to this one. You can actually specify the current line or the module selected. So I'll go ahead and do this one from a current line perspective. So cust group, if you remember, it actually carries a reference to a payment term. So that's a relationship that it is automatically discovered, and it identifies that and it selects that for the migration. So you can say okay to this one. So if you go to your vendor configuration and payment term, you can actually see that this is also included for migration. So the select for migration is automatically enabled for this. The next thing that we wanted to do is, right, so now you have two set of tables. We need to be able to tell the system to say which one needs to go first, which one needs to go next, right? So there's a sequence that it needs to apply. So for that, you can actually specify the apply sequence. And when you do the apply sequence, but before I go to the apply sequence, so now that we have actually identified all the related entities, you can actually validate the data too. So we give you an option to say validate all records in this. So what it does is it basically goes and identifies. Cus group has a reference to payment terms. It will go in and check for every record in the Cus group table for the data in the payment terms. It will identify there is a record in the payment terms table. If not, it will flag you for that. So this is a useful thing so that you can make sure that your data integrity is there. If not, you can go in and fix that before you having to actually go figure this out in the staging. So if you do this for all rows, and depending on the volume, you can actually do this in the client. We can also do this as a batch processing, right? So one. So here, I did have a data that way so that you can actually see. So the Cus group table actually has a record referencing a payment term called N030. So this payment term does not exist in the payment terms table. So it tells you that there is a data that somehow got into the system that would cause a data integrity issue when you try and import this into Dynamics 365 for operations. So you get to do these kinds of things and fix the data right in the source itself. And if you ever wanted to come back and look at this instead of validating this all the time, there is a form called missing reference data. And when you select this tied to the row, this will actually give you that data as well. So you don't need to do this every single time. But if you do need to, that's harmless too. You can actually go in and do that. So the next thing is you want to be able to actually go in and apply the sequence. So the system can actually use the relationships and then apply the sequence for you as well on the target. So when you say apply sequence, this will actually go and compute the sequences for you. And it will store that information in terms of which entity needs to be imported first. And I'll show you when it actually does the export configurations. And you will actually see that it actually determines that payment terms need to be imported first. And then it will do that. But as part of your implementations, as SAs who might be working with you, we would have told you, hey, use data packages, create data packages for your configuration so that can actually help you to do these things. So one of the things that which you would do as part of the data package on the Dynamics 365 for operations side is you would have created entities and you would have sequenced those entities. So if you had done that exercise as part of your customizations being carried forward to Dynamics 365 for operations, and if you had created data entities and the data packages, we give you another way to sequence this, another way to go through these configurations. So that basically means you've already done the work on the target side. So take that package definition and you have an ability to be able to import the package. And when you do the import package, we read the package definition, the entities and the sequence, and we automatically select those tables for migrations. So that's another convenience in a way as how you could actually go in and use it. So I had no investments on Dynamics 365 for operations. I only have 2009. Use the ways as how I talked about. Activate related, validate your data, apply the sequences. I have done all my investments, or I am a partner. I have data packages that I've created typically in a way as how I would like to help my customer. I'd like to repeat that for my 2009 customers and importing those configurations. Just import the package. We use the package template definition and select all the tables based on the entities and sequence them as well automatically. And we export the data at that package granularity. So both ways, right? So that's pretty much in terms of what it is, right? So then what you can actually do is, once you have defined this, you can now create a migration group. When you create a migration group, so this is basically as a way as how you indicate to the system that this is the granularity that I'd like to export. So this is one configuration for the export. This is the granularity that I'd like to export. So here you can actually see that it picked up a name for the migration group, which is what I have actually given. And the default place where I wanted the packages that will be generated needs to be created. If you want to enable incremental runs for this configuration, so you enable this. When you enable this, what it does is it starts keeping track of the modified date time for those tables. And it will track the changes based off of the modified date time, and then it will use that to be able to actually export that information when you do the incremental iterations. So right now we'll just go ahead and save. I did that. Yes. So it has created the migration group for you for that company that what you have selected. You can actually go look at these entities. It'll actually have those two entities that what we have selected. So we started with one, and then we asked it to find the dependent ones, and it found those two, and it selected for those. You will see both of them in this thing. So a couple of things that are interesting in this UI, right? So one is tied to each of these things along with the source table and the target entity. You can actually go look at the mapping. So when you select the field mapping, you can actually see the corresponding source fields and the target field to which we could actually map. We try and do the mapping as much as possible by inferring the source and the target field names, but the ones that which we have missed, you can actually come back and then select and do the mapping for the ones that which based on the staging entity fields from the target side. The other things that what you can actually do is, so this is also the place that what you can actually see. If you had defined a conversion rule for a particular extended data type, and if the field uses that extended data type, automatically the system picks up that conversion rule for you. If you didn't define one and you want to define, you have an ability to be able to create conversions right here and associate that to this mapping. So you can do that here as well. Another cool feature that we have in this is, oftentimes what you want to do is, I don't have a target field that I would want to map to, but what I want to do is I want to provide a default value. So anytime a record is exported, I want that record to actually have a default value. So you could do it that way too. So what you do is for the particular field that which you would want to provide a default value, you can enable the set default value. So this default data button gets enabled, and you can actually provide whatever data that you want to be used as a default data. So every record that gets exported from the select, it will use this default data definition and it will provide the default data for you as part of the export. You can actually come to the migration group directly and then select individual tables and then go do that. So that's why we also give you an option to do the apply sequences for the entities that you've selected here, right from this place. Or if you're coming from the entity list page, the previous screen that I showed you, we automatically pick up the sequences based on the sequences that you've actually defined. So we've done everything. So this is another places where you can actually see if you had a source query that you want the system to use, you can actually see the source query here. If not, it will be select star from cus groups for this example. You can override to actually provide your own SQL as well. And this is again not X++ SQL syntax, this is the ANSI SQL syntax. Right? So once you have done these, you've created your migration configuration. So you've enabled your company for migration. You've looked at what tables data is and how the data distribution is. You've gone ahead and configured by specifying those parameters of where your 2009 database is, where your Dynamics 365 is. You did your generate mappings. You populated the basic set of information about how you want to configure your financials, etc. Then you went into the entity list, specified the specific set of migration configurations, and you created a migration group that you want to use to export. So this is the currency in which the system will actually export the data for you. In this case, we have two tables that which you would like to export. At this point in time, you can actually go in and do the export. So if you remember, one of the parameters on the third parameter screen was at what increment that you want to actually go in and do the versioning for your exports. So this is important. So we actually use this definition whenever you want to actually go do the delta runs, and I'll show that to you as well. But it basically starts with the incremental number that you specified in the parameter. and it uses the date range and then export this as a data package. All the formatting specifics that you have provided in the parameter defaults here. The delta run is not enabled now because for this configuration, this is the first time you're actually running this. So you can actually export this as a package, and you can override the file system that wherever you have specified in the parameters here again. And you can do the client-based one, that is basically the client execution to actually do the export. Or if you're exporting large amount of information, you wouldn't do that in the client, and you can do this as batch. This is another option that we've added, which is nice. Instead of just having this to be just exported as a file system, you can say import package in the target. Based on the parameters, whatever sandbox that information that you provided, will actually import this package onto the Dynamics 365 instance, whichever one that you specified in the parameter. I want to show a couple of things as part of the package itself that we did based off of whatever that we did today. Right, so this actually did create the packages for you. And if you look at the execution history, we actually track all the parameters information in terms of what was used to do this thing, and then it actually keeps track of the rows that what got in. If you do the export again now, right, one thing that you would see that the delta run is not enabled again here. So if you have noticed, when I created the migration group, I did not enable this for doing delta runs. So that's why it's not actually supporting this for me. So you need to actually enable the migration group for it to be delta run enabled for you to be able to actually go in and do. But if you had, what it will do is it will allow you to actually pick that. You can actually see that it actually picks up the same parameters that what was used to run. So this way, if you have scenarios like, hey, I did something, but I want to import again. You would have these types of scenarios, so that's when this would be handy. And here again, you can actually do the import package into the target if you would want to. Right? Couple of more things and then I'll open it up for Q&A. Okay, very quick. So, if you had seen this, I think there's a lot more sort of changes from the previous ones that I have actually shown. So a couple of more things that I wanted to highlight before I close this thing, right? So I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So from your customization standpoint, all you would make sure is, so in this case, as you can see, the cus group was customized. It keeps track of this as a custom. So there is a customizations involved with this thing. And it's able to actually map as long as the mapping information is there on the target. You don't need to do anything other than just selecting the generate mappings in the parameter. Right? So no additional work that you need to go do. And always look at the entity coverage from a planning perspective. So this gives you the detailed information in terms of where you are as of now, and then where you are missing the entities. And you can actually go in and plan for, if there is an aspect that you intend to migrate, you can actually plan for making sure to add that entity coverage. And if it is an entity that is supposed to be a standard one, please log a bug. And if it's missing, right? You can actually export this information into a spreadsheet. Look at the ones where the target entities are blank, and that becomes your focus in terms of how you would want to determine. So that maps to exactly, that is basically as how we are showing you this information. So that's a way as how you can actually get the report out so that you can actually work with the respective teams from a planning perspective, right? So hopefully this makes sense in terms of what we did, right? So a couple of more things. Now I want to show you quickly the package itself. So this is the one that which we just did now, trcus demo. It actually has a file for every table that was included in this thing. And if you look at the manifest, you can actually see that it actually includes terms of payment as well as the customer group. And it applied the sequence level 1 and 2. Right? So that's, so it does a lot of heavy lifting for you in terms of understanding the relationships. As long as you've done the table definitions, the relationships and stuff correctly, the system can actually use those and then infer that as part of the export, and the tooling actually helps you get to that. Couple of more things that I wanted to show very quickly. Let's say, for example, I talked to you about the consider for migration case. So these are basically the ones that which we think are the eligible ones that which you should be migrating. So you could have a different approach, or you might be using the system in a different way. What we have considered may not be relevant for you from a migration perspective, so you can actually go and uncheck that. So that would not be something that we would consider for migration. The other way around, which is, we did not know about a table that you've added that you would like to include for migration. So we wouldn't even know to consider that for migration. So the way as how you can tell the system to consider that for migration is, that is when the enable applies. So the enable will be enabled for the ones that where we haven't understood the change that what you have brought in. So you can actually enable that for migration, and you will see the consider for migration checked. And then you can select that for a particular migration group and have that as your configuration. Right? So very quick, I wanted to use one slide to talk about where we are with the timeline, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. Bear with me. One slide, I promise. So that was the demo. Hopefully it made sense in terms of what it is. Right? So from a timeline perspective, right? So we're looking at spring release for the general availability. The tool is officially in its preview stage. We have been working with a selected set of customers, more like a private preview if you were to. We have been discussing about making this available from a broader consumption perspective, but we have never been able to do that because with the amount of changes that we had to go in and do, we wanted it to be a little bit more materialistic so that you can actually take advantage of this tool. So we truly believe we're in that stage now, and we have officially did a cut for us to be able to actually do this one. So if you have been working with Shelly from a preview access perspective, you will actually get an email this week about how to access the tool and stuff. We have a connect that which we have opened it up for this one exclusively. And then we will also have a private Yammer group that which we will actually add you to that. So you can actually use that to provide and give us feedback as we go through. Right? So you will actually get an email if you have been working with Shelly and have requested access for those tools. But if you didn't, I have left the contact information as part of this slide deck that you can actually go in and reach out to us, and we'll actually add you to that now. So that's where in terms of where we are. From the training perspective, right? So we've done a couple of these sessions in the conferences, that's number one. But we actually do it to the extent of this hour to hour and 15-minute sessions. So I can honestly say I have not done the due diligence in terms of showing you every single things, taking you really by having you go through the journey of realizing a legal entity moved from your source to the target. We obviously have not been able to do that within this 1 hour at a time in terms of what it is. That's what we do in these workshops. So we have some of these workshops that's already scheduled. I have fixed dates from an EMEA perspective. We'll also publish the dates for the ones that are going to be happening in US as well. So these are typically like a day, 2-day type workshops if you were to, where we'll actually have you bring your database, and we'll work with you in terms of you going through the experience of using this with your data. So that's what we do in these workshops. And we intend to actually do this a lot more because we understand that this is an interest, because there's a good set of customers who are coming from 2009 wanting to migrate and would like to take advantage of those. So we'll keep this program live for some good portion of this thing. One last information. So what you saw from the UI in terms of some of those configurations, right? So you saw everything about financials. From a roadmap perspective, there's still some gaps with this tool. So retail is very different from 2009 to Dynamics 365 for operations. So the retail specific entities are the ones that what we are working on now, and we have actually fairly done. So that should light up as well. You saw when I showed the slides, I talked about security as one of the things that which we will support. So the user group based security to role based access control type security will give you the mapping for those as well. And we'll have the mapping for those for the out of the box roles that which you can extend to. So we'll give you the support for that, so that's not there yet. So the whole supply chain aspect, specifically around the warehouse management aspects of things, right from the site, for us to be able to. So you didn't see a similar one like ledger for site in this one. So you will see some more constructs that which we will add as part of this thing. So that is something that is what we are working on, and you will see those things light up from now until to spring. So those are something that which we will actually provide from an incremental standpoint. So if you get this thing from a preview, so one of the things that which you might ask is what are we going to do from a release cycle in terms of how we provide the changes or the fixes tied to this thing. So this is part of the platform set of components as how we are managing. We'll definitely look forward to actually providing updates on a more monthly basis to this, aligning to the set of platform. But if you have any sort of blocking issue that is preventing you from using this tool, use the Yammer group to give us feedback. So when you receive the email from Shelly, it will actually have the connect link as well as the Yammer group invite so that you can actually join to that. So give us feedback through the Yammer group and we'll actually address those. And if it's a bug, log a bug and we'll actually go in and fix those. So hopefully that makes sense. Good. With that, so here are the contacts. Hopefully the session was useful. So please do fill out the surveys. I'll leave the contact slide and then I'll open it up for Q&A. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, May.
I had a question about using the delta capability. So if you were going to activate that, then it would automatically update. If you choose not to do the delta, then you're going to bring it into your current system. You have to manually delete them. Is it doing updates now?
Yes. So the question was, if you didn't do the delta and then you actually did an export all, what it would do on the target side? Would it do an update or would it do, corrupt the data if you were to, right? So everything that you have in your data entities on the target, so the data entities always support insert or update. So if the record already exists, it will do an update. If not, it will actually do an insert. Yep. Go ahead. So is there a document that outlines step-by-step approach in terms of what it is? Yes, so we have an implementation guide type thing if you were to. So we'll actually share that as part of the tool as well. Yes. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't get that. I expected this question. So how do you handle tables without the modified date times, right? So we absolutely require this as part of this. So when you enable the delta runs, as part of this, so we enable that and we actually tell you if it's not, so you need to actually go and make the change for us to be able to actually enable that. Sorry, go ahead.
So this is pertaining to data. How do you move the code from class to job?
So this migration tool that I showed is everything pertaining to the data. So what is it? Do we have anything from a code aspects of things, right? We don't have any specific tooling around the code. So the code migration is something that you would have done the same from a 2012 upgrade perspective as well. As the same approach that what you would have to go do. Analyze, plan on only ones that are relevant for you to be able to bring it into the Dynamics 365 operations. Do the code migration and then use the tool. Sorry, go ahead. Would you copy and paste them for the code? So you actually, from a data model perspective, you would actually have to bring them in. From a class perspective, probably yes, right? We've thought about actually providing a utility for you to be able to bring these as XPOs and then convert them into XML and stuff like that. We haven't spent too much time on that yet, but at least right now the code migration is a manual exercise. Sorry.
Does this tool offers us wizard to customize new entities?
I didn't get the question, sorry.
The tool offers us a wizard like to fix that in 12 to customize new entities, to create the query, the classes, everything or not?
Sorry, I still didn't get the question correctly.
The tool offers us a possibility to create through a wizard a new entity.
Okay, so as a tool actually gives you an ability for you to be able to create new entities, right? So from a 2009 perspective, we're not having you to actually create entities. So you need entities on your target, which is Dynamics 365 for operation. On the source side, you only have to have tables. So what we do is by the way of doing the mapping, we actually map the source tables to the target entities, and as long as you have entity representations on your target, which is the D365 for operations, you're good. So you don't need to create entities on your source site specifically. Sorry, go ahead. So the question is, can we actually have a template type approach so that you could take the configurations from one customer and then reuse them into your... Absolutely, yes. So you can actually export this definition, and then you should be able to actually use the same in another implementation. So this is modeled exactly like a repeatable template. So the export configurations that you're defining, you could do that for one company and you could do that for multiple companies and you can actually export that and use them in the others too. Sorry. So if I understand your question, for the sequencing that what you are doing, do we have to do that for... No, do we have to do that for all entities or only for the custom ones? And the way as how this is when you define the migration group, you're actually defining the sequence for the granularity of the migration group. Whatever set of entities that are included in that, you apply the sequences for that. Because you could actually mix and match in any way that's meaningful for your implementation, that is why you are having to do that. It has nothing to do with custom or standard. Sorry, go ahead. Good question. So what do we do with historical transactions if the tool doesn't bring in by default and I have a requirement to actually go use the historical transactions, right? So our recommendation is that if it's purely from a reporting or an inquiry type set of things, right? So we want you to actually use the Power BI capabilities to actually use that as a source to be able to actually get that information. And you can do mashups now, including both the 2009 as well as this for you to be able to. And one of the things that we intend to actually do is to provide template samples for those so that you can actually go in and do that. So there may be other scenarios where for transactions that you intend to do in the target, you might need to refer your historical transactions. And there are scenarios like that too. In those cases, what we are recommending is we are suggesting that you don't try and bring the whole transaction in its entirety, because the posted one includes, from a data completeness standpoint, right? You need to actually have the transaction tables, the related accounting information, and all those set of things. Oftentimes, there is no entity that actually does that stuff for you. And if you try and do it, the chances are you're going to miss some tables. So our recommendation is understand the scenario that you need to be leveraging the historical transaction on the 2009 side. Just have a custom table. Just bring only the relevant information that you need to complete the transaction, and then go use it. So those are the only sort of two patterns that what we've come across in terms of for cases like where you need to go back from both from a reporting perspective or from a transaction perspective. If you have new set of patterns from a customer standpoint, work with your SA, who is actually assigned to help you as part of the implementation, and will actually come up with the right recommendation in terms of if it doesn't fall into any of these two patterns. Sorry, there was a question at the back. Okay, our goal is to actually, so the question was, is that intent to support AX 4.0 and the prior versions as well along with 2009? That is one of the things that we wanted to actually support. We've prioritized the 2009 in terms of these things. I don't have a fixed timeline in terms of when we can actually go in and do so. As we enable, we'll announce that as well. Sorry, go ahead.
When you said there's 10 entities where 2 may be virtual, so you can create 8 in target, what happens to that shared data that was in those virtual security, for example, 2009 sharing customers, they all have the data ID of all those virtual companies. So what will happen if you just only have the 8 in target in order for the customers?
So the question was, I talked about virtual companies in a way as how it is. So when it comes to the virtual companies, right, so remember, you would define one data area as your virtual one. And then you would actually have the actual legal entities that would be using the virtual company for its transaction, right? So if you had created customers in your virtual company, the model is data replication on the target side. That means what used to be one, you would now have n representations of those. So that means if you had one legal entity, two legal entities that was using those virtual companies' data, on the target you will actually have two copies of that customer data. Yes. Yes, exactly, yes.
Just by providing this tool, what do you think that the downtime for the upgrade moving from the AX29 to Dynamics 365?
Good question.
I know
So,
that there is many factors, how big the entity, customization, the modules that has been implemented, but if we are talking about the standard like financial cost, trade and logistics.
sure. So the question was, what does the downtime look like if you are using this approach from a migration perspective, right? So as you mentioned, there's a lot of factors that control the downtime in terms of what it is, right? So what this tool helps you is, it helps you to land the configuration data in a good way, right? And then the open transactions and the opening balances in a good way. What we expect as part of the implementation that you would be doing is, right, using this migration approach, you would build your golden configuration on the Dynamics 365 for operations. So that would have all the representative data that you intend to migrate, and you would have gone through your UAT as part of the data that's using the golden configurations data. You're not going to go back and do all of these processes right in your cutover time frame. That's not the expectation. So the expectation is that you do these things as part of your implementation, get your data migrated, validate your system, you go through your UAT using the migrated data, make sure that you can do your business in a way as how you expected it to be done. There is business continuity validations there. Then you do your cutover. When you do the cutover just takes the data from the golden configurations, and you're not going to go back to your this thing. So that's just the restoring the database in terms of how much time that it takes. There's only thing that you want to make sure from the downtime perspective is the last bit of incremental thing that you need to actually bring in from an open transaction perspective, that you want to orchestrate to actually see how long it's going to take. Only that part. So that is why it's important to practice the migration configurations to make sure that the configurations in a way as how you are exporting the open transactions and importing into the target, they go through seamlessly. And any data anomalies that you are finding based off of how you are using the system is already resolved. So when you do the final cutover, it actually goes through smoothly. And that, I don't expect it to be too long. And it should be a very small percentage of your overall cutover process. So the question is, if there's any balances, those would be. So if you do the export of those entities as well, the answer is yes. Sorry, there was more questions here. Go, please. I am sorry, I didn't get that question. So our question is, how does a tool figure out which tables are custom, and is there any manual process involved with that? So we understand what's part of what we ship. So that's basically SysZip, GLS, GLP, and all of those things that we know very clearly in terms of what are out of the box. So anything that falls outside of those, we mark them as custom. Sorry, go ahead.
How comes country stabilization? Context of Dynamics 365, some countries will be revised only in 2018.
So I expected that question. Good one. So the question was, what about localizations, right? So there's not. So from a 2009 perspective, right? So I think we had a finite set of countries that we had supported. The last one that we did was Israel, right? The same way, those localizations got carried forward into Dynamics 365 for operations, right? So you have those on the target. If you have data entities for those, the processes don't change, and you would be able to actually use the tool as is. If you have less coverage for those localizations, right, then you need to actually work on those to make sure that you have the right coverage for those set up as well. From a migration approach and the tool and the process perspective, there's absolutely no change. Sure, go ahead. So just in this very quick thing, right? So I can actually stay here. The session's over by 5 minutes ago. I think it's just a lunch break. So it's perfectly fine. I can stay here and answer as many questions as you have. Please go ahead.
The last slide with the
Thank you. So this tool will work for AX 2012 as well. No, so this is primarily targeted for 2009. So from a 2012 perspective, we actually have a mechanism for how we can actually do this. Come back to the same room after lunch. That's what we're going to talk about. Yes, same room, come back after lunch.
I guess have you considered just doing, because you go 2009 to 2012, then 2012 goes to the spot, and then get all your historical data. So have you considered automating that, or is that on the roadmap?
So the question is, for somebody who wants to get everything, so for somebody wanting everything, instead of just the selected set of things, they could go through the approach of 2009 to 2012, upgrade, and then 2012 to Dynamics 365, where we support the upgrade in terms of what it is. We've heard this requirement again and again. We're not primarily suggesting that as a recommended approach, primarily because the amount of transformations that the product has gone through, it's significant compared to 2009 to 2012. So from a 2012 perspective to Dynamics 365, the starting point for that was R3CU9 of 2012. That is the baseline for what we did with Dynamics 365. If you look at that, there's everything that whatever we did, we actually have them in Dynamics 365 as a baseline. You're not missing anything. But 2009 to this thing, it's a significant transformation. From the platform, from the even when I say platform, right, the server, the client, everything is different. So it's fairly an impossible exercise if you were to. But that said, right, you can give some tooling in terms of getting those XPOs converted into this. So those sorts of things you will see light up. But you are never going to be able to actually get a good coverage in terms of doing an automated from a code standpoint. And from a data standpoint, we want to be particular that, it's so historical. We want you to reevaluate the data to see which ones are relevant that you want to really bring in. And if you truly want to keep that data with the capabilities like Power BI and the mashups and things like what we are doing, you can actually keep that data as long as you want. You don't need to actually delete or throw it away or any of those things. So for all historical reasons, for whatever that you need, you're not going to go in and create new transactions there. So that's the rationale in terms of what it is. I'm yet to find somebody who is actually going to say, without doing the whole thing, I can't do my business, right? So that's the state in terms of why, that's the rationale in terms of why we are doing what we are doing so far. So we haven't thought about that as automating that yet. I'm sure, if we find a real need for it, that might definitely be in a roadmap for us. Right now, that's not the case. Intercompany orders. Okay. I'm not sure specifically in the context of where we would be. So if it is a transaction from an intercompany perspective, right? So if you had those documents created, we'll definitely have those as part of it. So there's nothing fancy about it. But if it is a document that's not created, or if the document's created and it's processed, there isn't anything that which this tool would actually do to bring them in. So from that standpoint, the intercompany purchase order, the sales orders, we don't treat them any differently. So they are standard candidates that you should be able to. If you see the source query in the tool, it'll actually select everything from the sales table, for example, where status is in progress. So that's the way as how it'll actually do. So it'll bring in anything that's open, and it doesn't differentiate from that perspective. Yeah. It doesn't actually do this from a reservation perspective. So anything that is Master data, setup standpoint, we will actually bring in. If it is pertaining to balances, we actually bring in from an opening balance perspective. Anything else, you need to make sure that we have the entity. So that falls into the missing coverage area, basically.
It's a process.
Yes. Shari, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I missed this. Is it possible to use this to integrate to the common data model so you can move these packages towards the common data model with entities? Or is it mainly targeted for?
Beautiful question. So the question is, can I use the extracted packages to load it into this, right? That is the direction as how you should see us doing this thing. Right now, this is targeted for bringing the data into Dynamics 365. That if you had attended that CDS session, you would have heard that we are planning on doing the get data type support. So that will support for these patterns too.